All right, I think we're live. Happy Friday and welcome to the Green Room. If you're rocking with us for the very first time, this is a intimate conversation series that we're having as an extension to our course called Community College, Designing Black and Brown Spaces. Today, I'm really excited to have a buddy, Radha, join us and to just have a conversation about her journey and her path in design, in life, and beyond. So thank you so much, Radha, for being here. How are you?
Sure. I'm good. It's been busy, but we're keeping our heads afloat. So I think better rather be busy than bored at this point.
Nice, nice.
Yeah.
I see you rocking the cactus and Sade, Superman back there. This is so cool. I wish my background was as cool as you.
Thank you. Thank you. I take no credit for it, but I'm glad you like it.
Dope, dope. Well, take a minute or two or three to just give a quick introduction of like yourself, like what you do, where you are in the world, and things that you're passionate about. Quite a crazy
Sure.
year in 2020. So just give us some context as we get this conversation started.
Yeah, definitely. And like if I forget things or if it doesn't make sense, just let me know and I can always connect the dots in different ways. I am currently in LA. I'm usually based in Oakland and I kind of split my time between LA and Oakland, California. My name is Radha, by the way, for anyone who doesn't know how to pronounce it. And I am trained as an architect. So kind of, in buildings architecture, not software architecture. Um, Grew up in LA for the most part. Families from kind of India and spent a lot of time in a few different cities as I was growing up. And um, ended up moving to New Orleans, where I have some family, but who have been there for years and years and years. But ended up moving to New Orleans to study architecture, and got to that city, was there for a minute, and then Hurricane Katrina hit. And that was an education in design, let me tell you. Like, it was one of those things where you really start to understand, where does design fail and how can we actually use design to help people, communities thrive. And that was just a very massive awakening at a time where I think I was still in a little bit of a foggy stupor of, like, what even is my role as a designer? What is my perspective of design, and where do I feel like I fit in this discourse, where, like, oftentimes I really didn't see people like myself,
Mhm.
coming into these spaces, um, having the kind of conversations around design and like talking about like representation and like, design for people. I was like, for who people? Like, what people are you talking about? It's not my people. So that was it was really, really interesting, and ended up living in New Orleans for like 6 years, was very much part of, the kind of like rebuilding effort. And like, you kind of felt like anyone who like stayed behind and kind of stuck it out really was this family, and there's this bond that we all have, and I have family there, and so like that kind of made it doubly special. um but I also very early on knew that I didn't want to be an architect, even though I did my undergrad and graduate degree in that. And graduated, had the like misfortune or fortune or whatever it is of graduating into the recession, with a degree in an industry that people just weren't funding at the time. So worked for a little while in New Orleans, came back to LA, worked in a studio in Santa Monica, and just felt like, I'm sitting here designing like restaurants and bars and houses for rich people, but like, what am I really doing in the world right now? And it just didn't align with who I thought I wanted to show up as a designer. Um, and also, like, I was just not as interested in like the bureaucratic, um, just hurdles that you had to constantly negotiate, in that space, just to get something built that ultimately I felt like I wasn't satisfied with. So I, on a kind of like, took a leap of faith and moved to London. Went to a university called Central St. Martin's. Got into a program called with a focus on narrative environments, and they basically said, like, it was based in spatial practices, but they basically said, like, take everything you learned in architecture school and unlearn it. Like, just flip it on its head. Not that it's not good, but like there's a different way of thinking about design and a different angle to take it with. And so what that really brought forward for me was that was this thing around like the research side of architecture and the speculative side of design, which was really about thinking about the role that design has and the impact it has on people, and on the future, right? On like shifting culture, on changing behavior, on impacting our ability to be resilient and healthy, all of those things, right? And if you start to think about the role that architects play in society in designing buildings, we're essentially designing future artifacts. So like we almost have this responsibility to think about, what is the world going to look like 30, 40, 50, 100 years out when my building still stands and people are still inhabiting it, right? And what effect do I have on people? And that kind of like got me into the space of future studies, which I wasn't like as well versed in that at the time. I was curious about it. There were a lot of really cool what we call paper architecture movements that I was starting to kind of dabble in, with the Metabolists in Japan and Super Studio in Italy and Archigram in the UK. And then there was like a little quirky little arts collective out of the Bay Area called Ant Farm, with some Tulane alumni, and which is where I went to architecture school. And I was like, man, this is really cool, but like, how do I make money off of it? Because, we got to put a roof over our heads. I don't have daddy's pockets to go back to. Like, that's just not an option. So, so I ended up starting to work with a company called Arup for their Foresight team. And it's Arup is like an engineering and design firm. They're global. One of their biggest projects was the Sydney Opera House in Australia, and was really lucky to have some really wonderful mentors who were like, hey, we see this potential in you, what do you like, let's teach you about foresight as you're kind of working through it. And I was like, oh wow, like, one, I really love doing this, and two, I'm not bad at it. Like, it's this whole practice of like having to navigate uncertainty and like be incredibly imaginative and guide people through that process of thinking about the future, which, to be really honest, like, our brains aren't wired from an evolutionary perspective. Our brains are not wired to think that far out, because like, if you're out there gazing at the North Star, like, something's going to come and eat you behind you. You know what I'm saying? Like, you need to have more of an understanding of your immediate environment to survive, typically. So I just started to kind of get more into that, worked with Arup for 3.5, almost 4 years, came with them from London to San Francisco. SF was never in my plan, but I've kind of been in the Bay for like 6 years now, maybe almost 7. And then worked for a couple other companies, and have landed at Autodesk, where I'm getting to actually I lead the foresight practice now at Autodesk, and I'm getting to really build that from the ground up and build it in this vision of, how do we, as an organization that puts technology out into the world that designers and makers use every day, how do we ensure that the technology is being used responsibly, but also that, we are very aware of the folks we're leaving behind, and we're trying very intentionally not to continue to do that. So the core of that practice really confronts this question of like, who is this preferable for? Whether it's a technology, a tool, a condition, a scenario, whatever it is, who is this preferable for? And I very rarely found us asking ourselves that question in other rooms that I was in. So it's kind of like cool to be in this position where I'm getting to really lead this effort and shift the culture around how we think about the future and who we include in that conversation. And that's kind of where I am now. And I know that was like a long spiel, but thank you for the patience and listening and all of that.
There's a lot that was in there. I want to rewind back to, when you were a little girl, like, did you always know that you wanted to like study architecture and go in that direction? I know some parents,
Yeah.
paying engineering or like law school over their kids' heads.
Yeah, no.
So take us back. How did you even know
Yeah.
the North Star as a little girl, like which direction you were going to go?
Man, I love this question because no one ever asks it and I never get to think about that. So actually I come from a family of architects. Like my last name, Mistry, means craftsman.
Hmm.
Um, so it is like quite literally in our blood in some way. And my grandfather was an architect, my aunt is an architect, my dad, he's retired now, but he was an architect. And my mom went to art school in Bombay. And so I, in a very like unconventional way, was raised by parents who were like, yeah, no, creative things are good. You don't need to be a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer.
Hmm.
Like make and build. And so my dad used to have a workshop in the garage of our house growing up. And, like Saturday and Sunday mornings, he would just be out there like in his own little world building stuff. And I would go, and one, I loved the smell of like cut wood, like burnt wood. I just loved it. So that is very like nostalgic for me. But also I used to go and like pick up the scraps from whatever he was building and just like put things together, these like weird ass sculptures with, a piece of like a tree trunk and like broken pistachio shells. And like I made a whole little village for like ants or something. I don't know. But it was and then when I got into high school, because I was in LA, we used to do these like weekend courses at the Pasadena Art Center. Um, and so they had these courses around like interior design and interior architecture. And so I started to I knew I didn't see myself doing like medicine or law or engineering. Like those, I loved math, I loved physics, I loved art, I loved English. I was just curious about everything.
Yeah.
And I was like, I don't want to be pigeonholed into one specific field because I want to have the ability to like constantly learn about everything around me. And I got to this place where I was like, man, like where can I just keep like making shit and like understanding how the world is changing around me and like being perpetually curious, like what's going to let me be perpetually curious. And it ended up being architecture at the time. Um, and also at that time, this was now what, like, I don't know, 20 years ago, maybe. There just weren't those like, we have all these like slash courses now, like these like transdisciplinary courses, and those didn't exist even just 15 years ago. So right, in the same way that they do now. um and so like the best thing for me at the time was architecture. um and I and so I was like, all right, cool, I'll still get to like make stuff for people, because that was really important to me. And I will get to learn about history and science and math and cultural studies and, um, and travel and just all of that. And so I think that I always knew that I wanted to be like a maker of some kind. But I didn't know, I think I went into architecture school not knowing if I wanted to be an architect, but also realizing that I didn't want to do anything else.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
That's a powerful construct, and I wanted the people who are going to like watch this and listen to this to know that it's okay, like, one,
Oh
to not
yeah.
pigeonhole yourself in any of those three traditional disciplines, and then two, kind of as the future keeps unfolding, it seems to be more and more important that we know about more things. So it's more important for you to be kind of a multi hyphenate, kind of a just jack of many, many things, or Jill of many, many things, as opposed to just a subject matter expert in one very, very deep silo. So yeah, it's
Yeah.
good to hear that from you and to understand like how that developed. And maybe like the next question that I'll ask that you mentioned is like futurism and thinking about like what the next thing is going to look like. I don't know how many, middle schoolers or high
Mhm.
schoolers or folks in college have just sat and thought about the future, or like parents have prescribed that they really, really do kind of the long
Mm.
look, a decade or two out. So just talk to us a little bit about like how you started to think about futurism, and like as you've developed and been some years in it now, like how's it evolved? How are you different as a human since you
Mm.
spend more time than most of us kind of thinking about what's ahead?
Oh man. I mean, I think I'll get to the like how did I kind of start with it and what it's about, but I think what I've learned is it has made me incredibly introspective, like sometimes maybe to a fault, but incredibly introspective, where like I am always considering the 10 different, you know, like the 10th order impacts of like a thing I'm doing, or something someone has said, or like a thing or something I've read or seen or stuff like that, you know. The so the way, sorry, hold on one moment, sorry. Sorry, sharing space. So um so in terms of like foresight and future studies, it for me it really started because I was interested, I was like captivated by the story worlds that all these people were building. You know, like there's this project that Archigram had come up with called like the walking city, or and like plug-in city. And it was this whole idea that that build as populations kind of become more transient, and as people like, you know, start moving around the world more, and they're not just like uh sat in the same city or town or village that they were born in, and they marry the person 10 miles away, or the girl next door, or the guy next door, or the whoever next door. You know, like how does the city then start to change in that environment, right? So they had these like, it was super quirky, these like buildings with like legs that would like move around as people moved around, right? So it was just like interesting to me to like start to conceptualize these things in ways that I like, that really challenged my own biases and my own assumptions about how I thought the world was supposed to operate. Like, wait, buildings can have legs? Like I can conceptualize these things walking, right? And so I was just like, man, like that is such a cool thought exercise, just to be able to like basically live in science fiction, and like, right, and just like dream up what all of these other like possible realms. And like, you know, I was the kid in architecture school who was like, man, like, is gravity really a constraint? You know, like, do I really, you know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah.
like, do I really need to think about this? You know, like, does my building need a structural system? I don't know. And so that was like my first thing in, which was like, okay, this is a space where you're not constrained by the governing laws of our physical world. And that to me was really cool. The other piece of it was this idea that I could kind of, going back to that like all-encompassing kind of field, the field of future studies requires us with a level of rigor to think about the social, the technological, the economic, the environmental, and the political kind of implications and ramifications of things, right? And the really cool thing about it is it's not the study of just kind of like looking at existing trends and seeing where those trends are going and how people are reacting to them. It's the step of before that. So there's this thing we called weak signals, and a weak signal is essentially this like fragmented indicator of a potential future. And so an example of that could be, you know, like, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago, you know, these like disparate little efforts of little labs trying to think about like plant-based lab grown meats, right? And now the trend is you see like Beyond and Impossible in like grocery stores and Burger King and whatever it is, right? But back then it was just a weak little signal. It was a dot somewhere in its own little world. And futurists at that time were starting to connect those dots and saying like, hey, there's this research lab in San Francisco that's doing this thing. And someone else is like, oh, and there's this group in Brazil that's trying to work with crickets. And like, there's, you know, these other folks who are trying to do this other alternative protein. Like, what could that mean? Like in a world where these folks all connect, what does that mean? And I loved that thought exercise. So it was just really cool to like, I almost felt like I was like in on some like secret world, you know, where you're having to like scan the environment for these like signals of change, and you almost like know things about the world that other people don't as yet. And then I got to be that mediator that got to pull other people into that conversation and say like, what could this mean for you? Right. And so like today, an example of a weak signal, which is becoming really strong now, is like Lil Michaela on Instagram, right? And like this digital avatar created by a studio called Brud in LA. And she is, or it is, or whatever, is like, is not a real human, but Recently she got signed by CAA, which is a talent agency that manages human beings. And like, can you imagine a world where all of a sudden, right? Like, exactly. Like, how cool and crazy is that though? You know? And
Yeah.
so like that whole practice of just being able to think about like, man, can you imagine a world, and like working with people to like to complete the end of that sentence
Yeah.
is what I'm so passionate about and what's so interesting to me, because then you come from this place of, wait a minute, I don't have to resign to the future happening to me. I get to have agency and control, and I get to have ownership, right? And people like me and people like you and stuff like that, we haven't always been pulled into that conversation about what happens to the future, what is my role in it, and how does it affect me. And so like that is what really brought me in, and that's what I feel like for the moment is why I'm here.
Yeah, that's so cool. I literally feel like I'm talking to like Carmen San Diego right now. You
Dude, I
speaking,
used to love that game. Carmen San Diego, man.
it's back on Netflix now. My kids like it.
No way.
Um, but
Oh my
like,
God, I used to watch that on TV when I was a kid.
yeah,
That's
you remember
awesome.
like Viles, small like network of criminals, and then the on the other side, there's a network of So as you're talking, like I
Yeah.
think about how big is like this futurist community, and how cool is it that, somebody who grew up kind of middle of the road, like my parents weren't rich, we weren't like destitute and dirt poor, but what I experienced definitely happened to me and to us, as opposed to us like being able to design it for ourselves. There was no thought of me being able to shift it as I was
Yeah.
going through it. So maybe that first question, like, is it a very large futurist community? Like, are you checking for so much research from different of these firms that you talked about, or is it a very tight knit kind of smaller thing?
I mean, we're at an interesting inflection point in the field right now where like there's like this like generational shift that's happening. So historically the community was, I mean, it's a field of practice where there's a level of privilege that
Mm.
you kind of have to grow up in to be able to even afford to just be able to have that kind of time to like, right, to like to just be like, oh, I'm just going to think about the future and like pontificate on like what might happen, and cool, bro, like how do you make money, how do I get food on my table? So I think historically, future studies has been around for a while. It's still a relatively young practice when you think about other fields of practice. But it it's a pretty small community even now. It's starting to get bigger. But historically there was, it was basically, and like no offense, but it was basically like older white men from a particular socioeconomic standing. What that lends itself to is a very while like interesting perspective, a pretty narrow perspective on how the world is changing and like how it affects people. And what I'm starting to see now and what I'm so excited about is there's this shift where like those folks were kind of, you know, um, the like original ushers of the future, and there's now space being made and people taking up space in new ways and saying like, wait a minute, the way that you talk about and think about and speak about the future is alienating to these other communities. So how can we build in new tools, new frameworks, new methodologies, and new languages so that we can be more inclusive and be more intentional about who we're actually designing for and who we're bringing into that conversation. um, and that to me has been super cool, and I feel like, I got into the field at a time when like that shift hadn't happened yet. So I look back to like my mentors and they are part of that original cohort. um, and they were, I wouldn't have been able to get into this field without that guidance, but like at the same time I think it's a good time for things to be changing. So yeah, and I think even now, because like it's becoming more top of mind. I think it's becoming more like, mainstream pop culture with all the uncertainty we're having to navigate. But the core community itself is still pretty close knit and like very small. Um, and there's folks like people either there's like a first or second degree connection basically um, to folks in the futures community from all over the world.
Yeah, it's good to know and to kind of put context and order of magnitude to like the size of it. And another thing I wanted to ask about, which I think is really cool about design thinking and folks who are like in this creative designer space, is that you have to take many disciplines and many kind of silos of information and activities that are going on in the world and distill them into something meaningful. I guess you're taking these weak signals from everywhere and like putting it
Hmm.
together, which is a little bit different than being an expert in just one thing and like knowing that domain really, really well. So, could you talk a little bit about how you manage to be smart enough and fluent enough in so many different spaces and like pull things together in order to say something meaningful to the audience that you have? Because as I'm a parent thinking about a 9-year old, a 4-year old, and a 2-year old, no one ever had to tell me that I had to watch the news and decide for myself whether something was true or false and like the whole
Mm.
research that's required. So as a parent, I'm like, Rada, help me figure out how to tell a generation how to take information from lots of disparate sources and to put
Yeah.
something together for themselves that they can kind of have as a guiding star. And
Yeah.
more generally, I'm thinking that folks even in this current generation would be would be
Oh
neat.
yeah. Oh yeah. No, I mean, I think like my baseline assumption when I walk into a room is I don't know anything. And
Mhm,
that's always where I start from, right? And what that allows for is a level as like one, a bit of like setting aside of egos,
mhm.
which is oftentimes how we get kind of like blinded and like pulled into one particular perspective or one particular way of being. Um and then the second thing is like, and it also then allows for like this again perpetual curiosity, right? And what I always ask myself is how can I make sure that I'm like getting out of my filter bubble and learning from folks around me, and like, and even if I'm in an environment where I'm a little bit uncomfortable, or maybe I have like there's like a feeling of disgust or like stuff like that, um that to me is a really good indicator to say like, okay, wait, why am I feeling this way?
Mm,
Is it because this thing isn't true? Is it because it doesn't align with my values, or is it because I don't know enough about it
yeah,
and so I need to learn more? And I think for me it's, I watch like BBC and Al Jazeera and CNN and Fox News. Not
yeah,
because I particularly agree with what the narratives that are coming out of any of them, to be honest, but because I think it's important to be able to have an understanding of how stories are being shaped around me. And then to feel like, okay, let me go and research as much and learn as much as I possibly can from people that I trust or people that I maybe don't, sources that I trust and sources that I don't, and start to see what those dots are and make those connections for myself. And I always come from this place of like my opinion about things, the way I operate in the world is constantly, it's like fluid. It's constantly like shape shifting, right? So I have my core values and I can always come back to those things and come back to my gut, um but the second I start feeling like I'm very sure about the way I feel about something, that
yeah.
to me is a signal to be like, okay, wait a minute, let me pause. Maybe I don't know enough about this again, And that's why like I'm super weary about being called a domain expert. Like the day someone says like, "Hey, you're a domain expert in this field, come in and talk to us." I'm like, "Wait a minute. I'm stale now. Like I've been stagnating. I haven't been, like this is not a good sign." Um and so I think it's this willingness to say, let me not just listen to one thing, or let me not just take in this one source, or let me not like, let me think before I retweet that thing. You know what I'm saying? That's real,
Talk about
you
it.
know? And think about like, for me it's always, I talked earlier about like what foresight has taught me is to have this sense of like extreme introspection. And so like for me, social media like Twitter and Instagram and Reddit and all that stuff, really great sources of research, but like I always am thinking about what are like the five things that happen if this thing comes true, or if I, you know, perpetuate this narrative, or support this person's point of view, whatever it is.
Yeah.
which might not be like the best formula for engagement online, but you know,
Yeah.
it's like, but it's how, for me, like how I try to make sure that I am being like responsible and also just like challenging my own filter bubble.
Hmm. So that makes me think, like, as a student of the past and like the present, and as you look into the future, like, how do you set goals for yourself, and like, how do you think about just learning and development and progression from a professional perspective, from a personal
Mm.
perspective? I don't know that I've ever asked a futurist how they think about like the future for themselves and how you climb the ladder or how you like move forward.
Yeah. You know what's so crazy is the running joke is like I'm really good at helping everyone else think about their own future and I'm not good at doing it for myself. So like I'm not, and I think part of it is like I don't know, you know, whenever I've always said I have goals but I don't make plans.
Hmm.
And the reason I don't make plans is because like the second you do, there's some uncertainty that pops in and says like, no, wait a minute, it's
Yeah.
not going to go the way you think it's going to go, right? Like I thought I was going to go to college and in New Orleans for 5 years and it was going to be totally great. And what happens? Hurricane Katrina hits, right? And like I'm as destructive as that was and as horrible and tragic as that was, like I don't think I would have had the perspective I have as a designer if I hadn't experienced that,
Hmm.
you know? And so like I think for me it's saying, I mean, I've even said, listen, I don't even know if I'm going to be in future studies in 10 years time
Yeah.
because I don't know what's on the horizon for me, and I kind of want to be like, I'm the thing I'm trying to like learn and I try to teach folks is to be comfortable with the feeling of uncertainty
Yep.
and the like not knowing, right? How can we, with a sense of agency and a sense of of ownership, kind of walk through towards the future in a foggy stupor and not be afraid. Um, and so for me, it's more about like less about like maybe what I want to accomplish because I think some of those things are starting to just like happen. You know, thankfully, I'm super grateful for that. But and more about how do I want to operate in the world as a human being,
Yep.
and then like whatever the universe provides around that is beautiful, you know. But it's like I want to be a good and kind person who makes space for other people like me, who helps folks not feel so frantic um, and you know kind of anxious about the future, and who supports my family and like is a good partner, and all of those, like
Yeah.
those to me are the things that I'm like moving towards. And whatever that becomes, whatever my the next iteration of who I am is, like I'm open to that, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that makes me think about a guest that we had, a friend of community college a couple weeks ago named Misa Hilton. She's a fashion designer. And she said, you know, more than anything, she said to the students, you should focus on being, and like all of the doing will like come after that. So like
Yeah.
the being kind, the being curious will start to kind of set a course for your daily, cadence. And then after that, the doing and the opportunities and things will just start to come into place for you. And,
Yeah.
she went as a 17-year-old, not knowing too much, to design for Mary J. Blige and Missy Elliott and all of the looks that we see
Yeah.
in R&B these days. It came out of a young mind like that. And I think that's so appropriate and so relevant to your statements too. Like the being is important right now, especially in
Hmm.
2020. We need to be humane and gracious and
Yeah.
all of
But
the.
then that's your North Star, right? Because everything else around shifts. And
Mhm.
like there's so much uncertainty we have to grapple with. But like at the end of the day, I know that like I know who I want to operate as a human being.
Yep.
And however that manifests, given the times and the context and who I'm with, that will change. But like, and you know, I truly believe that you kind of like attract the energy you put out into the universe. And so if I can continue to, this is feeling like a little spiritual now, but like if I can like, you know, continue to kind of like walk through the world from a place of kindness and like generosity of spirit and curiosity and you know, trying to really like genuinely make space for other humans in you know, gracious ways. I think like that to me is the best thing that I can do and the best version of myself that I can be, and to like be able to stand in my own truth. And I think what's happening now is people have kind of like recognized that as, you know, for lack of a better term, like as my brand. And so what's happening is folks are coming to me and being like, hey, you know, I know that you have no problem challenging people's points of view. Like we want you to come in and be the instigator or be the provoker, you know, like yeah, the person that kind of like brings in provocation. So I'm like, that's cool. Let me play that role, you know. But 15 years ago, I don't think that I would have said that, yeah, no, I'm the person that comes in and like challenges the status quo. You know, I was just like trying to figure out like, how do you put a building together so it doesn't harm people?
Yes.
You know,
Yeah,
how do you make a building stand with gravity, man? Like that's what I was trying to figure out.
yeah, it's an interesting, like when you come out of undergrad and you do something for some years, you get to a point where, okay, you feel like you know it, and you get to this realization that for all the hoops that you've jumped through and for all the people that you've seen try and fail to get into your position, and you touched on this before, like there's this gap between the haves and the privileged and like the have nots. I've come to a point where I feel like it's not that hard, and a lot of companies could do a better job to like create the access and create the conversations that need to be had in order for there to be more equity and equality, and um, you know, getting without getting too much into a tangent, it's interesting to get to this middle of career or like senior in career point where you now have the power to make some things happen for the community that you come from. And you've also got some power to like be that that voice of good trouble, like you're talking about,
Exactly.
to
Yeah.
provoke and to challenge the establishment. So I appreciate like the work that you're doing, especially kind of on both of those sides. Um, I want to do a little bit of a lightning round. Like we're like
Okay.
at halftime,
All
so
right.
can we just jump into, you know, you mentioned London, you mentioned LA, and a number of places. You mentioned Bombay, like your family's from India. So give me like, you know, two or three of the most interesting cities that pop into your mind as like destinations, either to just visit
Mm.
because you're curious about maybe the architecture or the like makeup of the city, or like rest. I just want to go to this place to like sit down and do nothing.
Yeah. Man, I wish I went to more places to rest. No, but Tokyo is amazing. If folks ever get there. And then what was really cool was I had gone to Tokyo for the first time just before I went to Rome.
Okay.
And that, like, looking at how those two cultures think about design in very, very different ways, and kind of approach contemporary design in really different ways, that juxtaposition was just breathtaking. I think like I love Toronto, and I love Toronto because I love the people that I you know get to interact with there, but also like there's such a rich kind of culture of design and art and music and all of that that comes out of that city. Um, New Orleans has a special place in my heart always. Like, I mean, my dream is to like have a little, you know, like double shotgun house and like a spot where, you know, my family can kind of go hang out in the, you know, after hurricane season, you know, and just chill out there for a few months and just kind of be and do. Um, and then, yeah, like Bombay, man, that city is just is so vibrant and so energetic, and like I don't think people realize how diverse India is as a country. Um, and I just that city is like feels to me at least like the heart of like my understanding of what India is. Um, and the food, the people, just everything is beautiful. Um, so I mean, there's a whole bunch of more places. I think I've been very lucky on, you know, as like a broke ass 20-year-old, 20 something to have had the opportunity to travel to all these places. Um, but yeah, those are the ones that kind of stick out for the time being, for sure. Yeah. And then like London, Berlin, you know, all those little like spots where like you have these like cities that were very much built around, like their contemporary culture is very much built around the just like the artists that decided to kind of like pop in there, you
Mhm.
know, and make space there. I love that.
Yeah, for folks that might be viewing that have never been to Europe, like, did you take advantage when you were in London to like it's a train ride or just a couple hours in any direction and you can get to like so many different countries and so many different cultures?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I was able to even do that. Cause like on, you could buy a plane ticket for like 25 € on
Mhm.
a really crappy plane, like don't get me wrong. Like there was no like luxury travel, but like, and then you just make do. It was like you found a little hostel somewhere or like crashed at a friend's place who happened to be doing an internship, whatever it was at the time. Or I would also get like grants for different art projects and
Mhm.
like community oriented artwork and get to travel because of that on really tight budgets, but get to like be in cities like Ljubljana and Slovenia and stuff like that, which I like. Slovenia was never even on my list of places that I wanted to check out. But this is what I mean about like being perpetually curious is you kind of then open up the world and open up these opportunities that maybe you didn't think you would have access to. So yeah, man, that train ride from London to Paris, I used to love doing that. The being able to just hop on a plane and go to like Barcelona or Lisbon or Berlin or whatever, it was great to have that. And I wonder, I've been back for work now, but the experience is so different and it still like pulls me back into that space of like being a 20 something, having a very different set of obligations and, exploring the world in a very different way.
We just follow on question to that around dispelling myths or stereotypes about maybe what you've seen of those places on TV or heard about those places from like something that's other than firsthand experience because you're now there in that city, like with those people eating their food and everything. Any insights or eye-opening things that like popped up as popped into these cities for the very first time?
Yeah, I mean, I think like I'm not gonna not to like I'm not gonna call out any particular city, but I think what I learned is if as long as I went forward from a place of, and I think I will say there's a level of privilege that even comes with the statement I'm about to make. But like even if I move forward from a place of like curiosity, generosity, spirit, and kindness, most of the time people were willing to kind of meet me there. And so like I remember being in a bar in Tokyo and like obviously could not speak Japanese. I think I know like 2 words in Japanese, you know. Um, and ended up and was there with a couple other friends from architecture school, and we ended up having a conversation with two young men across the table from us, and we literally were drawing on napkins, just like back and forth, you
Yeah.
know? And like, I would have never thought of having an exchange like that. And it just happened organically because we like cheers to them, whatever, like when we were drinking a beer or whatever. And they were curious about where we were from, and we were curious about where they were, what their life was like. Um, and like those moments, I mean, that happened like, I don't know, over 12 years ago, and it's still stuck in my mind. It was a simple little interaction, but um, you know, being able to kind of move through places without a sense of fear and just kind of like being open and saying like, hey, you're a human, I'm a human, what can we learn from each other? And I've found that in like almost everywhere. I was in Hong Kong a little while ago and like was walking through a like a farmer's market in an alleyway, and there was this fruit that I had never seen in my life before. And you know, again, couldn't speak the language. Like none of the languages I speak are useful anywhere but like India and the US. So couldn't speak the language, and a young woman had like come up and saw that I was kind of like curious about it. She's like, hey, let me buy that for you, and like I'll have the woman cut it up so you can eat it, you
Yeah.
know. And I was like, man, that's so kind, like I wasn't even asking for it. I was just like sitting there being curious. And so it's like stuff like that really sticks out for me. And those moments are simple and they're like unpretentious and they're just like a human to human engagement.
Yeah, it's so crazy that it probably costs him or her so little, but it like
Yeah.
means like so much.
Yes. Yeah. you know? And so like just moving through life with like a sense of gratitude, I think is so important, you
Yeah.
know?
Let's jump from kind of the travels to, let's see, like, are you a big Netflix and bookworm? Like, do you watch a whole lot? Do you read a whole lot?
Yeah, I do. I do. I am the weirdo that will always have 10 books that I haven't gotten to yet, you know? And like to the point, like friends will just send me books. Like that is my love language for sure, you know? So yeah, definite bookworm. I just consume a lot, partly because of work, because I have to. So television, podcasts, music, books, news article, like whatever it is, I'm consuming it. Um, Not with any like sense of order, or you know, it's like organized chaos is basically how I operate. But yeah, definitely.
So I won't make you say like your all-time favorites or anything. Maybe either give me like the favorites or give me the recents of maybe a couple of books, give me a
Yeah.
couple of shows and a couple of podcasts.
Oh man. Okay. So I'll give you recents because that's probably easier, and maybe a couple favorites. We'll see. Recently on, I don't even know why I've been watching it, but it's been interesting. I've been watching The Crown on Netflix. And then watched the Dave Chappelle's interview with David Letterman.
Yeah, that was good.
And really loved that. Yeah. And then podcasts, I just finished this podcast called The Rabbit Hole, which was put on, I think it was put on actually by the New York Times, but the reason I got into it is because I was talking to a friend about like how the internet, or how like social media just like pulls us into like in a very weird kind of subversive way, like pulls us into these like rabbit holes and these you know, cones of truth that we don't even know how we got there, or like why we believe in the things we do anymore. And so the premise of this podcast was this guy who was like having dinner with friends, was like arguing this really contrarian viewpoint. And then a friend asked him, like, do you actually believe what's coming out of your mouth right now? And he had this moment when he was like, I don't know. Like, I don't even know why I have this point of view. So he did this like eight episode podcast all about how like he started on YouTube and ended up on Twitter and just like found his way into this really radical point of view,
Yeah.
not by his own choosing, but by design of YouTube and Twitter. Um, and like, so that was super interesting to me. And then just like on a super basic level, I listen to The Daily. It's just a good little kind of like snippet for what's happening in the world that day in a way that's not overwhelming. Cause like,
Yeah.
right now on television, it's just a whole bunch of pundits continuing to, you know, talk about the same stuff in a revolving manner. And then books, I am almost done reading this book called Ants Among Elephants. And it's by this woman who grew up in the Dalit community in India, which has unfortunately been dubbed the untouchables in the caste system. And she like made her way out of India, which is like a miracle, and then works in New York as like a subway operator. But she's written this beautiful book on like the evolution of one Dalit family and how their kind of you know, like upward mobility in their life in society reflected how contemporary Indian culture was kind of shaped. And it's just like, it's a super nerdy book, but I just love that it's like, I love the fact that this woman is the author of it, and it's a pretty easy read. And then I don't know what else I'm reading, but I also have like 50 tabs open on my Chrome browser of things that I need to look at still, that are just like I found this digital fashion studio called The Fabricant the other day, and like they don't make any real clothes. They make clothes for digital avatars and like digital campaigns with other brands and stuff.
Yeah.
And their tagline was like, we waste nothing but data, you know? And I was like, okay, this is interesting. So I know that's going to be a rabbit hole later today or something. So it's just stuff like that, like things that just catch my eye. They might
That-
not be useful, but yeah.
The open tabs are like the new like the new library system. You're literally like, ooh, that looks good. Let me throw it in my
Yep.
cart. And then
Yep.
I'm starting to have anxiety. I literally open up my laptop every day and I'm like, dang it, why didn't I like finish or close this one out? I'm like halfway through this article and I got a meeting coming up in like 20
Yep.
minutes and it's going to take me an hour to fit. So it's
I
the
know.
struggle is real. Whoever
It's
at Google
real.
is creating the Chrome browser, thank you for making it so great
Accessible.
that it doesn't crash because of my 75 open tabs on a daily basis.
But you know what though? I've learned to like not pressure myself or punish myself for having that stuff open, you know, and like we live in a society where people are like, it's like always be optimizing, you know, and it's just, I've decided, I was like, you know what? I can't do it. Like I'm a human, I'm not a robot. So like, okay, cool. I have 50 tabs open. Maybe I'll close some of them. Maybe I won't. Maybe I'll just get bored and like decide that I don't need to be hoarding it anymore, you know? Um, but it's just like, I'm like, let me not beat myself up for that though, you
Yeah.
know. So
This goes into my next question because I'm now so happy that sometimes I get that blue screen or sometimes I get that random restart and then it kills all of my tabs and I'm like, I wouldn't have done that myself. But thank you, operating system, for making that happen.
yeah, but see, but okay, so mine doesn't do that. Mine re-ups everything the way it was before the crash.
Really?
So maybe I need to do that actually. Maybe that will help, you know, bring a little bit of like calmness to my life. But like seriously, my desktop and my internet browsers are definitely a reflection of like my brain in that moment. And the only word to describe it is probably just like frantic. So,
I feel
because
you.
you're constantly trying to like connect dots, you know. And I think like there are moments where I've had friends or my partner be like, stop trying to foresight this, just be, you know. And I'm like, I know, it's become a way of operating. And sometimes you need pause from that. Like sometimes it's not healthy to always be thinking about the future, you know.
Yeah. Maybe talk about like putting it on and taking it off. Is it like I can think about you maybe having an interaction with somebody that has no idea what you do, and then you're like foresighting them without them knowing it, and they're like, this lady is a little bit weird. Like, do you have to like put it on sometimes and then consciously like take it
Yeah,
off?
yeah, no, there are definitely moments where like I try to like, you know, quiet that noise a little bit. And because yeah, there's just context where like it's just not appropriate or not necessary. Um and so I'm I'm trying to be a little bit more conscious of that. It's difficult because like I'm the weirdo who will see a commercial on television and be like, oh crap, that's a signal for something, you
Yeah.
know? And like no one asked for it. It doesn't need to happen right now, but like you know, but I'm that weirdo that will do that. And then what I've also found is like at this point, most of the people that I have, you know, the opportunity to kind of interact with, whether it is friends or family friends or just like random strangers, they're on some level, like either someone has told them about the work I do or like they have kind of followed it. So there is that level of curiosity. So like it's so they ask me about what I do and like why it's important and all that stuff. And I actually appreciate that because it also makes me question like and continue to ask myself, why am I in this?
Mhm.
You know, why is this important to me? Like why is this work important and stuff like that? But yeah, there was this book called Normal that came out, and it's a very niche, weird book, but it was written by a person who works in future studies,
Mhm.
and the whole book was about a group of foresight practitioners who are suffering from this thing called abyss gaze because they've been like looking out into the abyss for so long that they've kind of lost their sense of reality and their sense of self. So it's just a whole bunch of foresight practitioners in like a mental asylum in the outskirts of like Oregon somewhere. You know, and so like that, I was reading that book. It's super short. It's like a novella. And I was reading that book being like, man, I've definitely felt like this sometimes, you know?
Yeah.
Um, because constantly having to grapple with uncertainty, constantly having to connect dots between things, like I love it, but it can be exhausting. And I think being able to reckon with that and like acknowledge that there are moments where even if you really love doing something, it can still be hard,
Yeah.
you know? Like that's okay. Um and I think like people don't talk about that all the time. Like they talk about the shiny bits, you know? And like there are moments where I'm just like, man, like I just don't want to do I don't want to do anything today. I want to play I want to play hooky, you know?
Yes.
And I
That's
think
every
that's
Friday.
okay. And I think yeah, and I think we need to normalize that a little bit more, you know, especially in this time in this society where there's this like you constantly have to be hustling, you constantly have to be like thinking about the next thing, you constantly have to be moving forward in some way, and it's just like, no, man, like let's give ourselves some space to pause and reflect sometimes.
Yeah,
I
I
feel like
love.
I've gone on a tangent, but yeah.
I needed to hear that today because every Friday, it's like I don't give myself a break, even though it's COVID,
Yeah.
even though I have children and like they're going through something unprecedented that'll maybe hope it doesn't scar them, but they'll never forget like this time.
Hmm.
Um, I have that tension between, one foot in the technology industry and then one foot like out there in the community telling people that want to get into this industry, here's a prescription, but then knowing that there's, we sent Teslas to Mars and stuff, but we haven't figured
Hmm.
out diversity and equality and inclusion
Yeah.
in like 15 years. So I'm like, there's this tension of like, we're so smart, but we're like so not able to move this simple thing forward. So
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
yeah, I sometimes we all just need to take a deep breath and rest and relax and chill out. But yeah, I know we're coming to the top of the hour here and it's toward the end of our time. So let me just say thank you. I appreciate the energy that you've put into this conversation. The background, you win like MVP for the background and the stuff you've got.
You could thank my boyfriend for that. He
Yeah,
it's all his decoration. Yeah.
give him a big hug and a high five from Brandon. Maybe just like last words to the maybe the high school kid or to the single mom who's pivoting because of COVID job wise, or to the elder even like who's popping in and wanting to know about the future that we're
Mm,
talking about. Just
mhm.
give a couple of things that you would leave people with to put in their back pocket as they move forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing, and I have to constantly remind myself of this, is like be gentle with yourself.
Mhm.
Um, and I don't think we do a good enough job of kind of like staying true to that. I think be curious. Um, challenge yourself to just to get out of your own filter bubble. If you start to feel like you're becoming too comfortable, like, your friends agree with you about everything you say, like the things you're reading make absolute sense all the time.
Yeah.
Get out of your filter bubble, my friend. And otherwise, like just reach out to folks and try to find connections with people as human beings. And I think like that in itself can be really magical and kind of lead to really interesting new opportunities. But I think like what we don't always do and we don't always give ourselves the time for is just to like connect with each other on a human level. um, and some of the most beautiful and rewarding work I've had the opportunity to do has been because I've just like developed really meaningful friendships with people, and we want to make cool shit in the world.
Yeah.
um, and yeah, that's what I got.
Amen to that. So, again, I appreciate it. I came into this conversation like not knowing all the questions, not knowing all the things, and I mean, this turned out to be something beautiful. So for
this was
anybody that's
gr-
watching this,
this was great. I mean, thank you so much. This was so energizing, especially for a Friday, so I really appreciate it.
yeah, well, take care of yourself, be safe, stay sane out there, and we will um, be keeping the Green Room series going. But this is a beautiful Friday. Take some time to take care of yourself and to enjoy that sunshine down there in LA.
For sure, for sure. Thank you, and have a good weekend.
All right, thanks so much, Ryder. We'll see you next time.
Take care.
All right.